Imagine for a second. It's a quiet evening in the mountains.
Just a normal night.
Right, a normal October night in 1963. You live in a valley in northern Italy. You can hear crickets, uh, maybe a dog barking in the distance.
Very peaceful.
But beneath all of that, there's this low, faint rumbling coming from deep inside the mountain above you.
Just this subtle, constant noise.
Exactly. And the thing is, this isn't a sudden surprise. If you live there, you've been watching the landscape subtly shift for months. You've seen cracks in the ground right in your pasture that are just silently widening. Trees on the steep slope above town are leaning at these odd, completely unnatural angles.
And you know for a fact that people are up there measuring it.
Yes, you know authorities are monitoring it, but life just carries on. Imagine living under that slope, feeling the ground literally changing beneath your feet, and just going to bed anyway.
Because what else are you going to do, right?
Exactly. But on this specific night, that rumbling turns into a wall of water taller than an 80-storied skyscraper. It wipes out your entire valley. It kills roughly 2,000 people in a matter of minutes.
Just erasing multiple towns off the map completely.
Erasing them so thoroughly that rescue workers arriving the next day couldn't even find the foundations of the buildings. And the most terrifying part of the official investigation that followed.
This is the part that just haunts the whole story.
The dam that held back all that water never broke. It didn't crack. It performed perfectly. Welcome to this deep dive. I am incredibly glad you are here with us today.
It really is a historical paradox, isn't it? It fundamentally breaks how we're conditioned to think about catastrophes.
Right, because usually something breaks.
Exactly. When an infrastructure disaster happens, the human brain instantly searches for a structural flaw. We want to find the cut corner.
We want to point at a rusted beam or, a cheap batch of concrete.
Right, or some corrupt contractor who ignored a crack in the foundation. Because, well, it gives us a sense of control to believe that disasters happen because things break.
If we just build it better next time, we'll be safe.
Precisely. But the tragedy of the Vajont Dam challenges that entirely. Our mission today, looking through these historical accounts, geological surveys, and the post-disaster trial records, is to explore this uncomfortable truth.
That we are looking at a disaster caused by an engineering triumph functioning flawlessly.
Yes, functioning exactly as designed, while a known, explicitly documented natural threat was just pushed aside.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this isn't your typical story of shoddy construction. To understand how a perfect structure can facilitate an absolute nightmare, we really have to go back to what it means to build something on this massive scale.
We need to set the scene.
Right. So, we are in the Dolomites of northeastern Italy. And we need to talk about the firm SA. That's the Società Adriatica di Elettricità.
A very powerful entity at the time.
Extremely. This is the late 1950s, leading up to the dam's completion in 1960. We're in the middle of a massive post-war industrial boom, right?
Absolutely. And the context of that boom is just essential here. Italy was modernizing rapidly after the Second World War.
Factories, cities growing, all of that.
Right, and that modernization required a staggering amount of electricity. SAD wasn't just building a single wall in a valley. They were essentially attempting to domesticate the hydrology of the entire region to feed the national power grid.
They were playing God with the rivers, basically.
Pretty much. And the Vajont Gorge was chosen specifically because it offered an incredibly deep, narrow canyon.
Which is perfect for a dam.
It's ideal for creating a massive, deep reservoir with a relatively small concrete footprint.
Right, and when we say a small concrete footprint, we are talking strictly about the width, because the height of this thing is just, it's mind-boggling.
It really is.
The Vajont Dam was built to be approximately 262 meters tall. For those of you listening who use the imperial system, that is about 860 feet.
Which made it one of the tallest dams in the entire world at the time.
Just a towering monument.
But, the height isn't even what makes it an engineering marvel. It's the specific structural classification.
Yeah.
The Vajont was designed as a thin arch dam.
Now, I have to be honest here. When you say the words thin and dam right next to each other, especially when we are discussing a wall of water behind it, every instinct I have starts flashing red.
It sounds like a terrible idea, right?
It does. I'm picturing this incredibly fragile barrier trying to hold back millions of tons of pressure.
Yeah.
It just sounds completely wrong.
Well, it does sound incredibly counterintuitive because A traditional dam, what you'd call a gravity dam, like the Hoover Dam, works exactly the way a child building a dam in a creek works.
You just pile up a bunch of heavy stuff.
Exactly. You pile up so much massive, heavy material that the sheer weight and bulk of the concrete holds the water back.
It fights force with mass.
Right. But a thin arch dam is a vastly more sophisticated piece of structural physics. Instead of relying on its own bulk, a thin arch dam curves horizontally upstream, pointing its convex face directly into the reservoir.
Okay, I want to make sure I am visualizing the physics of this correctly.
Yeah.
Think of it like this. It's like taking a relatively thin, fragile-looking eggshell, right?
Okay, and an eggshell.
And you wedge it into a doorway so perfectly that no matter how hard you push on the arched curve of that shell, the shell doesn't crush.
Yes.
Instead, it takes all that kinetic energy and transfers it outward, pushing the force straight into the solid doorframe. Is that close?
That is an exceptional way to conceptualize it, actually. The concrete itself isn't acting as a brute force wall. It is acting as a conduit for the pressure.
A conduit, wow.
Yeah, as the immense hydrostatic pressure of the reservoir pushes against the upstream face of the dam, that inward curve compresses. And as it compresses, it forces all of that unimaginably heavy load outward directly into the solid rock walls of the narrow Vajont Gorge.
So it's using the mountain against the water.
Exactly. The structure effectively borrows the strength of the mountains on either side. The surrounding geography becomes the true support system bearing the load.
So when we look back at the records of the firm SAD, and we look at their engineering specifications, we can definitively say they built an absolute masterpiece of structural engineering.
Without a doubt, it was brilliant.
But I have to push back a bit on the language that often gets used in the historical accounts of this project.
How so?
Well, you see, the word flawless used a lot to describe the dam. How can we call an infrastructure project flawless if its existence directly resulted in a valley being wiped off the map?
Right.
Doesn't the definition of a successful dam have to include, I don't know, the safety of the people living downstream?
Well, that tension right there is the core thesis of this entire tragedy. You are touching on the strict, often blinding boundary between structural engineering and broader civil or environmental engineering.
So they were only looking at the math.
In a vacuum, looking solely at the mathematics of the concrete, the stress distributions, and the structural integrity of the arch, the dam, was, by every metric, flawless.
It did exactly what it was supposed to do.
It was a triumph. The concrete cured perfectly, the rock abutments held the transferred load, and the arch performed exactly as designed. The firm SAD-AT achieved their localized goal with just supreme precision.
I try to imagine the psychological state of those engineers standing on the crest of that dam in 1960.
Oh, they must have felt like titans.
Right. You are standing in this rugged, ancient Italian valley. You've brought modern calculus, industrial might, and cutting-edge materials to basically tame a geological gorge.
You've conquered nature.
Yeah, you pour this 860-foot ribbon of concrete, and you successfully hold back an entire lake. The sheer pride, the sense of conquering nature, it must have felt like absolute invincibility.
And that feeling, it breeds a very specific kind of tunnel vision. Exactly. When you execute something that mathematically complex and monumentally large, you start to believe that your mastery over the structure extends to a mastery over the environment itself.
Like nothing can touch you.
The engineers looked down at their spectacular, perfect dam, and they trusted it implicitly.
But the problem wasn't down on the gorge. The problem is that while they were obsessing over this perfect shield they had built, they weren't paying nearly enough attention to the massive rotten arm holding that shield.
They should have been looking up.
Exactly. They were looking down when they should have been looking up. Which brings us to the geology of the area, specifically the slope rising directly above the newly formed reservoir, Mount Toc.
And this is where the narrative shifts, from an engineering triumph to a profound failure of environmental context.
Because the rock wasn't as solid as the concrete.
Not even close. The Vajont Gorge was excellent for holding a dam, but the mountainsides enclosing the reservoir were an entirely different story. Long before the dam was finished, and even during the initial surveys, geologists had identified severe issues with Mount Toc.
What kind of issues are we talking about?
Well, it wasn't solid, contiguous bedrock. It was highly stratified, sedimentary rock interspersed with layers of clay.
Layers of clay, which is, I mean, That's essentially a disaster waiting to happen when you introduce massive amounts of water.
Exactly. The mountain had a well-documented, localized history of landslide activity.
So this wasn't a surprise.
No, this wasn't a sudden, unexpected geological anomaly. The slope was naturally unstable, and they knew it.
There's an incredibly chilling detail about this instability in the sources. When you look at the cultural history of the region, the local communities weren't blind to this at all.
Right, they lived there for generations.
Exactly. In the regional dialect of the communities surrounding the gorge, the name Mount Toc carries a very specific, ominous meaning. Historians and linguists note that it roughly translates to something akin to the mountain that walks, or the walking mountain.
The walking mountain. Just haunting.
It is. Now, I know folk etymology isn't a hard science, but a name like that doesn't just spontaneously generate out of thin air. It points to a generational historical awareness that this specific slope moves.
Generational awareness is exactly right. The locals observed the creeping landscape over decades. But let's be clear here. This wasn't just folklore being ignored by arrogant men of
The
science.
scientists knew too.
Oh, absolutely. The scientific data was screaming the exact same warning. Because SETAG didn't just walk away once the concrete dried. They established a comprehensive monitoring network.
They were actually keeping an eye on it.
Very closely. They installed piezometers to measure groundwater pressure and a vast array of inclinometers and survey markers across the face of Mount Toc to measure surface movement.
Okay, so they were actively seeking data on the slope's stability. And I'm looking at the accounts of this data, and I'm expecting to see microscopic movements.
Like fractions of a millimeter.
Right, fractions of a millimeter that only a geologist would worry about. But the data they were getting wasn't microscopic at all.
No, it was massive, observable, and accelerating ground movement.
The mountain was literally shifting.
The mountain was actively creeping downward toward the gorge, and the instruments were capturing every single centimeter of it. And this wasn't a static creep. The rate of the movement was increasing.
And there was a direct, undeniable correlation in the data, wasn't there?
A very clear correlation.
The speed at which the mountain was tearing itself apart perfectly tracked with what City was doing down in the valley.
This is where we have to dive into the hydrogeology because the mechanism here is fascinating and it's just deadly.
Let's get into it.
The monitoring data showed that the movement of Mount Toc closely matched the rising water level of the reservoir. As AA closed the dam and allowed the lake to fill, that water wasn't just sitting passively against the rock face.
It was pushing its way in.
It was seeping deeply into the porous, fractured limestone and, crucially, into those layers of clay we mentioned earlier.
Now, I admit, I always assumed this was just a simple lubrication issue.
A lot of people do.
Like slipping on a wet floor. The water gets between the rocks, makes it slippery, and gravity does the rest. But it's much more violent than just lubrication, isn't it?
It is. Lubrication is a small part of it, but the primary culprit is something called poor water pressure.
Or water pressure. Okay.
Let's visualize this. Imagine the mountain as a massive stack of heavy books resting on a tilted table.
Got it. A stack of books on a tilt.
Normally, the friction between the books keeps them from sliding off.
Yeah.
But if you start pumping high-pressure water directly between the pages of the bottom book, that water doesn't just make the pages slippery.
The water has volume.
Right. The water actually bears the physical load. It pushes upward and outward, physically forcing the layers of rock apart.
So it's actively lifting the mountain.
Yes. It essentially creates a buoyant force inside the mountain itself, lifting the massive rock strata off their resting state and drastically reducing the friction holding the mountain together.
That is terrifying to visualize. You are essentially injecting a hydraulic wedge into a mountain that already wants to fall down.
That is exactly what they were doing.
So, to state the reality plainly, the higher they filled the lake, the more poor water pressure they created inside the rock, and the faster the mountain moved toward the water.
It was a mathematically documented inevitability. And the thing is, if the charts and graphs weren't enough, the mountain actually gave them a physical, undeniable warning shot.
A warning shot.
In November of 1960, as the water levels were rising during one of the initial filling phases, a massive chunk of the slope sheared off and plunged into the reservoir.
A literal practice landslide.
Estimated at nearly 1 million cubic meters.
Wow. So they had a physical demonstration of the worst-case scenario. Now, this is the part of the history that is so hard to digest.
It's baffling.
You have the generational warning of the walking mountain. You have the geological surveys identifying the clay layers. You have the daily monitoring data proving the slope is accelerating. You have the established correlation between the water height and the mountain speed.
All of it?
and you have an actual million cubic meter landslide into your lake. How on earth does an operation look at all of that and decide to keep filling the reservoir? It defies all logic.
If you look at it strictly through the lens of safety, it defies logic entirely.
Right, it's madness.
But you have to view this through the lens of human systems, institutional momentum, and what sociologists call the normalization of deviance.
The normalization of deviance. What's fascinating here is how success can blind you.
Precisely. When that 1960 landslide happened, the dam absorbed the minor wave it created perfectly. The structure held.
Wait, are you saying the fact that the dam survived the warning shot actually made them more confident?
Precisely. The success of the structure in 1960 blinded them to the escalating severity of the environmental threat.
They thought their dam could handle anything.
Exactly. They began to view the shifting mountain not as a catastrophic threat to human life, but as an engineering puzzle to be managed.
So they thought they could outsmart the mountain.
Cecidy's engineers hypothesized that they could orchestrate a controlled landslide.
A controlled landslide of an entire mountain face.
Yes. They thought if they raised and lowered the water levels very carefully, they could coax the mountain down in small, manageable chunks over time.
They thought they could domesticate a mountain collapse with a throttle. That is a staggering level of hubris.
It is hubris driven by immense commercial and political pressure. Cecier was deeply invested in this project.
Too big to fail.
Entire regional power grids, burgeoning industrial sectors, and a massive amount of sunk financial capital were all relying on this dam operating at maximum capacity.
So stopping wasn't an option.
To drain the lake permanently and abandon the project was economically and politically unthinkable to the executives and the government officials backing them.
So they prioritized the schedule and the bottom line.
As is so often the case.
They managed the symptoms, lowering the water briefly when the mountain moved too fast, but they absolutely refused to cure the disease by draining the reservoir completely.
They kept playing a deadly game of tug-of-war with the geological giant. In the years following 1960, they continued to fill the lake closer and closer to its maximum capacity, testing the limits of the slope.
Playing with fire, or, well, playing with water and rock.
By the late summer and early fall of 1963, heavy rains saturated the region.
Oh no. So natural water is adding to the artificial water.
Exactly. The heavy rains added massive natural groundwater pressure to the artificial pore pressure created by the lake.
A double whammy.
The mountain's movement didn't just accelerate, it went into a runaway state. By early October, parts of the slope were moving downward at nearly a meter per day.
A meter a day. You can physically watch a mountain move at that speed.
It's terrifying.
The residents of the valley certainly saw it. Imagine living under that. The cracks in your pasture aren't just widening month by month anymore. You can see them ripping open over a weekend.
Trees are pitching over.
Right. The roads on the slope are buckling. You know, the engineers are out there taking notes, but the massive concrete machine of the valley just keeps humming along.
Nobody's sounding the alarm to evacuate.
It's a psychological torture. You're trapped between a whispering landscape and a deaf institution.
The tension was undeniable, and yet the underlying assumption remained. Even if the mountain falls, our dam will hold it. We can weather the storm.
But the scale of what they were dealing with was beyond any mathematical model they possessed.
Way beyond.
Which brings us to the night of October 9th, 1963. The nighttime simply ran out.
It did.
Now, we have to be very deliberate when discussing the scale of this event, because the numbers in the historical and geological record are so massive that human brains actually struggle to process them.
On that quiet October night, at approximately 10:39 p.m., the massive, waterlogged rock formations of Mount Toc finally surrendered completely to gravity.
The friction beneath them was just obliterated.
An unfathomable mass of the mountain detached. Geological estimates place the volume at roughly 270 million cubic meters of rock, earth, and forest.
270 million cubic meters.
It's hard to even picture.
Now, it's worth noting that geologists and historians still occasionally debate the exact margins of that volume, but the consensus centers around that massive figure.
Yes, the sheer scale is undisputed.
To understand how destructive that is, we need to abandon the traditional idea of a landslide. This wasn't a tumbling, chaotic avalanche of loose rocks and boulders rolling down a hill in a cloud of dust.
No, the mechanism of this collapse is what made it uniquely apocalyptic. Because of the sheer scale of the failure plane deep inside the mountain, the entire 270 million cubic meter mass detached and slid downward, essentially as a single, cohesive, intact block.
As one solid piece.
Mostly, yes.
I was trying to find a metaphor for this earlier, and initially I thought of a massive piston dropping into a bathtub.
A piston.
But a bathtub is open, and a piston implies machinery. It is more like taking a solid, dense cinder block and dropping it violently into a narrow, water-filled trench.
That is much more accurate, and the speed of that cinder block is crucial.
How fast was it moving?
That intact mass of rock accelerated down the slope at speeds estimated around 100 kilometers per hour, or roughly 60 miles per hour.
60 miles per hour. A mountain moving at highway speeds.
When you take 270 million cubic meters of solid mass and introduce it into a confined reservoir of water at that speed, the kinetic energy exchange is almost beyond calculation.
Because water cannot be compressed.
Sure.
You can't squeeze water into a smaller space.
It has to go somewhere.
Right. When that solid mountain slammed into the reservoir, it violently, instantaneously evicted the water. It had nowhere to go but up and out.
The physical displacement was absolute. The landslide essentially erased the lake in a matter of seconds, pushing the water violently into the air.
And it generated a wave that defies belief. The wave of displaced water and debris surged upward, reaching heights estimated at approximately 250 meters above the crest of the dam.
To put that into perspective, 250 meters is over 800 feet.
800 feet.
The wave itself was nearly as tall as the massive 80-story dam standing beneath it.
Try to visualize that if you're listening at this. Imagine you are standing at the absolute bottom of an 80-story skyscraper. You look all the way up the sheer face of the building to the roof.
A dizzying height.
Now imagine that towering height, but instead of glass and steel, it is a solid, churning wall of black water, mud, and ripped-up trees moving faster than a highway speed limit, coming straight over the top.
And here is the fact that haunts the entire legacy of this disaster. When that 800-foot wave slammed against the upstream face of the dam and the millions of tons of water surged over the crest, the dam did not break.
It held.
It held completely.
It's unbelievable.
The thin arch design, that perfect eggshell wedged into the doorframe of the Vajont gorge, performed exactly the way the mathematics dictated.
So all that force just went into the mountains beside it.
The immense, sudden kinetic impact of the wave was transferred flawlessly into the rock abutments. The concrete didn't shatter, the structure didn't fail. It stood resolute against a force of nature it was never, ever intended to withstand.
But because it didn't break, the water couldn't just flow out from the bottom.
Oh, it couldn't.
The entire volume of that apocalyptic wave cleanly overtopped the dam and plummeted into the narrow Piave Valley below.
Just a free fall of millions of tons of water.
And we have to talk about what was in that valley.
The valley was deeply populated. Directly in the path of the gorge's exit lay the town of Longarone and the neighboring tightly knit villages of Pirago, Rivalta, Villanova, and Fay.
It was nearly 11 p.m. Most of the residents were asleep in their beds. They had no idea.
The only warning they had was the atmospheric displacement.
The wind.
Yes, some survivor accounts describe a massive, deafening blast of compressed air rushing down the valley just moments before the water hit. The mountain falling into the gorge had pushed the air out in front of the wave like a hurricane-force wind.
That wind blast alone was powerful enough to tear roofs off buildings, wasn't it?
Yes, and strip the clothes off people in the streets before a single drop of water even arrived. And then the wave struck.
The erasure of Longarone and the surrounding villages was absolute. It wasn't a flood that slowly rose and submerged the town. It was a kinetic impact that scoured the valley floor down to the bedrock.
The death toll is estimated at between 1,900 and 2,000 people.
Nearly 2,000 human lives.
Entire family lineages extinguished in minutes. The force of the water pulverized concrete, twisted railroad tracks into knots, and scattered debris for miles.
The survival stories from the immediate impact zone are incredibly stark because they rely entirely on the brutal physics of geography.
There was no outsmarting it.
Right. There was no swimming out of this. There was no outrunning it.
Survival was binary. The only people in the immediate vicinity who lived to see the morning were those who happened to be positioned on higher terrain that fell physically above the maximum water mark of the wave.
You either were high enough or you weren't.
Exactly.
And there's a devastating irony here. There were a handful of people situated slightly further up the valley who survived purely because the dam itself held back the lower portion of the reservoir, preventing the entire lake from washing down.
That's true. The dam's strength saved some.
But for the 2,000 people directly beneath the overtopping wave, the dam's structural integrity was irrelevant.
When the morning sun rose on October 10th, the visual contrast was jarring. The valley floor was a flat, unrecognizable wasteland of mud and boulders. Longarone was simply gone.
Just wiped clean.
But if you looked up the gorge, the dam was still there, standing tall, entirely intact, with a massive new mountain resting behind it where the deep blue lake used to be.
And naturally, when the world wakes up to a tragedy of that magnitude, the immediate demand is for accountability.
As it should be.
The Italian government launched extensive criminal investigations, which eventually culminated in trials aimed directly at, say, executives, their engineers, and the geologists who had been reading those piezometers and inclinometers for years.
The trials were complex, spanning years and involving intense scientific debate, but ultimately, several key individuals connected to the firm and the project were convicted of manslaughter and negligence-related charges.
Now, when looking at the trial records, the core legal and ethical argument doesn't center around the construction of the dam itself.
It couldn't.
Right. The prosecution couldn't argue shoddy engineering because the dam was still standing there as physical proof of its own excellence. Instead, the entire trial hinged on one specific concept: foreseeability.
Foreseeability is the crux of the Vajont disaster. The courts determined that the danger of a massive, catastrophic slope failure was substantially foreseeable, based on the vast mountain of monitoring data the company had collected.
They hit all the clues.
SAG knew the mountain was moving, they knew the water was causing it, they knew 1,000,000 cubic meters had already fallen in 1960.
Now, I can imagine the defense trying to argue that nobody could have predicted the exact scale.
That was a major part of their defense, yeah.
They might say, well, yes, we knew a landslide was possible, but nobody could have foreseen an entire mountain dropping in one intact block and creating an 800-foot wave. But does that defense hold water? Does it matter if they couldn't predict the exact millimeter of the wave, if they knew the slope was fundamentally doomed?
That is exactly the nuance the courts wrestled with and ultimately rejected as an excuse. You don't need to predict the exact height of the wave to know that dropping an accelerating mountain into a full reservoir positioned above a populated valley is an unacceptable risk to human life.
The risk was obvious.
The engineers were convicted not for a failure of structural mechanics, but for a catastrophic failure of judgment regarding the environment in which their machine operated.
They built a perfect machine in an inherently doomed location, and they ignored the flashing red lights of the natural world because it was inconvenient to their institutional momentum.
Vajont forces us to reconcile a very uncomfortable truth about human endeavor.
Which is?
A project can be an unambiguous, world-class technical success. It can perform perfectly under mounting external pressure, exactly as it was mathematically modeled to do, and still be the direct catalyst for a catastrophe of unimaginable scale.
And there is a haunting physical monument to this truth. That dam is still standing today, over 6 decades later.
It remains structurally sound, a permanent fixture wedged into the Vajont Gorge. You can go and visit it.
It is a staggering thing to look at. It is a dual monument. On one hand, it is a testament to brilliant world-class engineering. On the other hand, it is an eternal tombstone marking absolute catastrophic hubris.
It's a very heavy place to visit.
Honestly, staring at photos of that dam today forces us to completely redefine what a failure actually is. We are so used to equating failure with a broken part.
Like a snapped cable.
Right. But Vajont proves that something can be a total success on paper, a total success in its physical design, and an utter failure in its application to reality.
That is the paradox we set out to explore today. The technology didn't fail. The context in which that technology was aggressively, stubbornly deployed failed disastrously.
They just refused to see the big picture.
The human ability to respect boundaries failed.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want you to think about how this applies far beyond a gorge in the Italian Alps.
Because it really does apply to all of us.
Think about your own life or your own industry. We don't all build 860-foot thin arch concrete dams, but we all build systems.
We do. We build operational processes, we build organizational structures, we build software architectures.
Think about how often we build a perfect system. Imagine a flawless financial spreadsheet where every formula works perfectly, or a completely foolproof, optimized business plan, or even a rigid, highly disciplined daily personal routine.
We love our routines.
We do. But how often do we become so utterly obsessed with our system working exactly as we designed it that we completely ignore the mountain of context shifting right above our heads?
The world outside the system.
Exactly. The market dynamics change, or our physical health shifts, or the people around us are giving us clear warning signs, but we just keep pointing at the spreadsheet saying, look, the math works, the system is flawless.
It's the danger of a narrow focus, and it raises a critical question that I want to leave you with today. We are so deeply conditioned to fear the collapse of the things we build. We worry constantly about the engine breaking, the bridge falling, the code crashing, the dam bursting.
We're obsessed with breakage.
We are. But what if our greatest vulnerability isn't that our technology will break? What if our greatest vulnerability is that our technology will work exactly as designed, giving us a powerful, intoxicating, false sense of security right up until the exact moment the natural world reminds us who is really in charge?
Wow. That is the thought that is going to stick with me for a long time.
It's sobering.
It really is. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in your life isn't a crack in the wall of your house. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is the low, quiet rumbling coming from the earth deep beneath it and the creeping realization that the ground is shifting while you are just sitting comfortably inside, blindly trusting the roof.
A perfect roof doesn't matter if the ground falls away.
Exactly. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Take care of yourselves, pay attention to the shifting ground, and we'll talk to you next time.